There are doors in your life that you believe are sealed forever. Not locked, not barricaded, just settled into their frames by the sheer weight of time and assumption. You learn their shape, the grain of the wood, the way the light falls across the threshold, and you accept them as permanent fixtures in the architecture of your existence. You don't even think to test the handle. My friendship with Leo was a room I lived in, comfortable and familiar, and the door to anything more was one I had long ago accepted as sealed. But that night, with the rain slicking the city into a watercolor of blurred neon, he didn't just test the handle. He pushed the door wide open, and the sudden draft of possibility was enough to extinguish every candle of certainty I had ever lit for myself. He was asleep, or at least pretending to be, a state of being he had perfected over the past 3 months. His head was a familiar weight against my shoulder, his breathing a slow, rhythmic tide against the shore of my collarbone. The movie we had supposedly been watching had long since faded to a murmuring credits roll, its blue light washing over the planes of his face, catching in the dark sweep of his eyelashes. For hours, I had been a statue, a living piece of furniture, my entire consciousness focused on the single point of contact where his temple rested against my neck. It was a practiced stillness, a form of meditation I had unwillingly mastered. To breathe too deeply might disturb him. To shift my weight might break the spell. And so I remained, caught in a state of exquisite torment, a museum piece titled Man Pretending This Is Normal. But then, something shifted. It wasn't a large movement, not a jolt or a stir. It was smaller, more deliberate. The pressure of his head eased, and I thought he was finally waking up, that the delicate truce of our ambiguous intimacy was over for the night. I prepared the usual script in my head, the casual words I'd used to shepherd him toward the spare futon or, more likely, out the door and back to his own apartment. But he didn't pull away. Instead, his fingers, which had been resting limply on the cushion between us, uncurled and found my own. It wasn't a grasp, not at first. It was a question asked in the language of touch, his thumb tracing a slow, deliberate circle over my knuckles. My breath caught in my throat, a sharp, silent gasp. Every nerve ending in my body, which had been lulled into a state of drowsy acceptance, suddenly flared to life. The air in the room grew thick, heavy with everything we had never said. This was new territory. Our ritual of exhausted, post-crisis comfort had rules, unspoken but strictly enforced. Proximity was allowed, even encouraged. His need for a physical anchor was the premise upon which this entire fragile structure was built. But this slow, conscious intertwining of our hands, was not about comfort. It was about connection. It was a line being drawn in the sand, and I could feel the tide of my own long-buried hope beginning to rise, threatening to wash it all away. I held my breath, waiting for the punchline, for the sleepy, mumbled apology that would allow us to retreat to our respective corners. But it never came. The pressure of his thumb on my skin remained, a steady, rhythmic pulse that seemed to beat in time with the frantic drumming in my chest. And in that quiet, rain-slicked moment, I understood that the door I had thought was sealed was not only open, but that he was standing on the threshold, waiting to see if I would invite him in. We met during a pickup basketball game on a sweltering July afternoon 4 years ago. That sentence feels too simple, too clean for the seismic shift he represented in my life. It was a day when the air itself felt sticky, and the sun beat down on the cracked asphalt of the public court with a kind of personal vengeance. I was there more as an observer than a participant, a photographer by trade and by nature. I found a strange beauty in the chaotic ballet of the game. The explosive grace of a layup, the sweat sheen on a player's back, the fleeting expressions of triumph and frustration. I was capturing the geometry of human effort, framing moments of raw, unposed life. I played, of course, but my game was quiet, defensive, built around seeing the court and anticipating movement, much like how I used my camera. I was a supporting character in other people's highlight reels. And then Leo arrived. He didn't just walk onto the court. He seemed to materialize out of the heat haze, all long limbs and an easy, lopsided grin that felt like it could melt the asphalt. He was kinetic energy personified, a whirlwind of motion and laughter. The game, which had been a lazy, heat-drugged affair, instantly changed its tempo. He moved with a fluid, unconscious confidence that was mesmerizing to watch and even more intimidating to play against. He was a creator, a natural focus of attention, the sun around which the rest of us began to orbit. His smile, I remember thinking with a jolt that felt like a physical impact, hit harder than the final score ever could. It was genuine, blinding, and he used it like a universal key, unlocking conversations and forging instant camaraderie. I, of course, remained on the periphery, content in my observational bubble. I watched him through my viewfinder and, without it, cataloging the details. The way he'd push his dark, sweat-dampened hair off his forehead. The competitive fire that would flash in his hazel eyes just before he drove to the basket. The easy, encouraging clap on the back he'd give to a teammate who missed a shot. He was a study in extroversion, a language I understood academically, but could never speak fluently. I took a photo that day, one I've never shown anyone. It's a shot of him laughing, mid-sentence, with another player. He's looking just slightly off camera, his head tilted back, and the harsh afternoon sun catches the curve of his throat and the genuine joy in his eyes. It's a perfect photograph. It captures not just a person, but a feeling, the feeling of warmth, of life at its most unguarded and vibrant. It was the first of 1,000 secret photographs I would take of him, most of them only with my mind. Our friendship didn't ignite. It coalesced, slowly, like morning mist gathering over a field. He was the one who initiated it, naturally. After the game, while I was packing my camera away, he jogged over, wiping his face with the hem of his jersey. "Hey man," he'd said, his voice still breathless. "You got some moves. Quiet, but smart. And that camera, you a pro." I mumbled something about it being a serious hobby, feeling the familiar heat of social anxiety creep up my neck. I expected the conversation to end there, a fleeting moment of post-game politeness. But Leo had a way of ignoring social cues of retreat. He saw a closed door and treated it like an invitation to knock. He asked about my photography, about what I liked to shoot, and he listened, truly listened, with an intensity that was both unnerving and deeply flattering. He didn't just hear the words, he seemed to absorb them. We started meeting at that court every week. It became our space. He would play with his characteristic fire, and I would play my quiet, supportive game, and afterwards, we would sit on the worn wooden bench, drinking lukewarm water from plastic bottles and talking. He spoke about his life with a startling openness. He was a software consultant, a job that felt comically at odds with his physical presence, but he explained that it was like solving a puzzle, a different kind of game. He talked about his long-term girlfriend, Sarah, a name that always landed with a quiet thud in my chest. He spoke of her with a comfortable, practiced affection, the way one speaks of a familiar and cherished piece of their own history. He was restless, he admitted once, caught between the person he was, the college athlete with dreams of playing overseas, and the person he was becoming, a man in a sensible career with a sensible relationship. I, in turn, found myself opening up in ways I rarely did. I spoke about my work, about the silent conversation between photographer and subject, about trying to capture a truth that exists for only a fraction of a second. He was the best audience I'd ever had. He never filled the silences, but let them breathe, understanding that for me, quiet was a form of communication. Our friendship was built in that space, in the comfortable quiet after the noise of the game. It felt safe. It felt solid. And somewhere within that solid foundation, buried deep beneath the concrete of plausible deniability, my own feelings began to take root. It wasn't a sudden crush. It was a slow, creeping realization, like watching a photograph develop in a darkroom. A faint outline of affection slowly sharpened into the undeniable, high-contrast image of love. A love I knew I could never, ever speak of. To do so would be to risk the entire structure, to send a tremor through the one foundation that felt truly stable in my life. So I became an archivist of unspoken moments, a curator of a secret museum dedicated to the way his hand brushed mine when he passed me a water bottle, the sound of his laughter, the specific shade of his eyes when they caught the evening light. It was a lonely, beautiful, and agonizing collection. The shift, when it came, was not a subtle tremor but an earthquake. It arrived in the form of a late-night phone call on a Tuesday in October. I was developing photos in my makeshift darkroom, the scent of fixer sharp in the air, the dim red safe light casting the room in an infernal, intimate glow. My phone vibrating on the shelf was a violent intrusion. I almost ignored it, but something made me answer. It was Leo. His voice was a wreck, a shredded version of its usual confident timbre. "She's gone," he said, without any preamble. Just those two words, hollowed out and brittle. I didn't need to ask who or what he meant. The name Sarah hung in the silence between us. They had been together for 6 years, a geological epoch in the timeline of our 20s. She was a fact of his life, a permanent part of the landscape I had so carefully mapped. He explained, in broken, disjointed sentences, that it had been coming for a long time. A slow erosion of connection, a gradual drifting apart that they had both ignored until it became a chasm. It wasn't a dramatic fight that ended it, but a quiet, heartbreakingly adult conversation. She had packed a bag while he was at work. It was over. Can I come over?" he asked, his voice so small it was almost lost in the static. "I don't want to be in my apartment. Everything is." Hers, it was the first time he had ever sounded truly lost. Leo, my magnetic north, my fixed point of energy and light, was adrift. Of course I said yes. He arrived 20 minutes later, looking like a ghost of himself. The usual light in his eyes was extinguished, replaced by a dull, shell-shocked emptiness. He was wearing a wrinkled t-shirt and sweatpants, and he didn't seem to know what to do with his own body, his large frame looking awkward and out of place in my small, quiet living room. He sank onto my couch, not so much sitting as collapsing, and stared at the blank television screen. I didn't know what to do. I was a photographer of moments, a silent observer. I captured emotions. I didn't know how to mend them. All my usual tools, patience, distance, a lens to hide behind, were useless. He needed something I wasn't sure I knew how to give. So I fell back on the practical. I made him a cup of tea, which he held in his hands for warmth but never drank. I sat on the other end of the couch, maintaining a careful, respectful distance, and I just let him be. For a long time, he didn't speak. The only sounds were the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sigh of city traffic. I felt like I was holding my breath, terrified of saying the wrong thing, of offering a cheap platitude that would only magnify his pain. Finally, he spoke, his voice raspy. "It's so quiet," he said, looking around my apartment. "It's always so quiet here." He didn't say it like an accusation, but like a discovery, as if he was noticing for the first time that my world operated at a different frequency from his. He then began to talk, not about the breakup itself, but about the silence she had left behind. The absence of her keys in the bowl by the door, the missing sound of her humming in the kitchen, the vast, empty space on the other side of the bed. He was describing the negative space, the shape of a person defined only by their absence. And I, a person who had spent his life framing such spaces, finally understood what he needed. He didn't need advice or solutions. He just needed the silence to be filled, not with words, but with presence. He needed an anchor. And so I sat with him, late into the night, a silent witness to his grief, feeling the tectonic plates of our friendship grinding against each other, shifting into a new, unknown, and terrifying alignment. That night marked the beginning of the ritual. It was a pattern that emerged organically, born from his need and my inability to deny him. It started with a text, usually late in the evening. "You up, or a movie night?" It was a question, but it felt like a summons. He would arrive at my door looking frayed at the edges, the vibrant energy that defined him muted and exhausted. He brought with him the ghosts of his old life, a palpable aura of loneliness that seemed to fill my small apartment. We would put on a movie, something loud and distracting, full of explosions or car chases, anything to drown out the silence he so clearly feared. He would sink into one corner of my worn leather couch, and I would take the other, a carefully maintained cushion of space between us. For the first few weeks, That space was a rigid, unbreachable border. We were two separate islands in the dim light of the television. But grief is a persistent tide, and it slowly, inexorably, eroded the shoreline between us. It began with his foot brushing against mine. Then, one night, exhausted from a long day of pretending to be fine at work, he let his head fall back against the cushions, and it happened to land on my shoulder. He jolted, mumbling an apology, but I, acting on an instinct I didn't know I possessed, just said, "It's okay. You're fine." He relaxed, and a silent treaty was signed. My shoulder became acceptable territory. It was a small concession, but it felt monumental. The weight of his head was both a comfort and a quiet agony. I could feel the warmth of him through my shirt, smell the faint, clean scent of his shampoo. My entire being would become hyper-focused on that single point of contact, every muscle tensed in an effort to remain perfectly still, a reliable, unmoving piece of architecture for him to lean on. Soon, he began to fall asleep. It would happen an hour or so into the movie. His breathing would deepen, the tension would leave his body, and he would become a dead weight against my side. The first time it happened, I was paralyzed with indecision. Waking him felt cruel. Letting him stay felt dangerous. It felt like a transgression against the carefully constructed boundaries of our friendship. I ended up draping a blanket over him and sleeping, cramped and contorted, on the other end of the couch. I woke up before him, my neck screaming in protest, and watched him in the pale morning light. His face, stripped of its usual guarded smile, looked younger, more vulnerable. A deep, protective ache bloomed in my chest. It was a dangerous feeling, that potent mix of tenderness and longing. When he finally woke, he was disoriented and apologetic, but there was a flicker of something else in his eyes, relief. He had made it through another night without having to face the emptiness of his own apartment. The ritual evolved. He stopped apologizing for falling asleep. It became an unspoken expectation. He would arrive, we would start a movie, and at some point, he would drift off, his body naturally gravitating towards mine as a source of warmth and stability. The futon in my spare room went unused. The pretense that he might go home at the end of the night was quietly abandoned. Sometimes I would manage to disentangle myself and move to my own bed, leaving him on the couch. I would lie awake for hours, listening to the sound of his soft snores through the thin wall, my mind racing. I was analyzing every gesture, every sigh, every subtle shift in his sleeping form, searching for meaning where there was likely none. Was this just about comfort? Was I just a convenient, human-shaped pillow? Or was there something more, a subconscious acknowledgement of the connection I felt so profoundly? I lived in a state of perpetual, low-grade anxiety, a photographer trapped in his own darkroom, waiting for an image to resolve. Each night was a new exposure, a new composition of limbs and blankets and shared silence. I was terrified of overexposing the film, of flooding the delicate image with the harsh light of my own feelings. The ambiguity was excruciating, but the alternative, a world without his presence, without the solid weight of him beside me, was unthinkable. The door to his room was always left slightly ajar now, a silent invitation for me not to leave him entirely alone. I would see the thin sliver of light from the hallway cutting across his floor and know that it was a signal, a plea. And so, the ritual continued, night after night. He would seek refuge in the quiet of my apartment, and I would offer it, all the while knowing that the comfort I was providing him was slowly, methodically, breaking my own heart. I was the keeper of his peace and the architect of my own exquisite suffering. The progression was so gradual, so incremental, that I almost didn't notice the landscape changing until I was in a completely new country. The space on the couch, once a demilitarized zone, became shared territory. One evening, deep into our third month of this unspoken arrangement, he shifted in his sleep, not away from me, but towards me. He turned onto his side, his face now buried in my chest, and one of his arms came to rest across my stomach, his hand loosely curled against my ribs. My heart hammered against my sternum so violently I was sure it would wake him. This was different. This wasn't the passive, gravitational pull of an exhausted body seeking support. This was an embrace, however unconscious. I lay there for what felt like an eternity, every nerve alight, tracing the shape of his fingers through the thin fabric of my t-shirt. It was the most intimate touch I had ever experienced, and it was happening under the guise of sleep, in the perfect gray area of plausible deniability. I started to think of my apartment not as a home, but as a charging station. Leo would arrive depleted, running on empty, and he would plug into the quiet, steady current of my presence. He would leave in the morning looking more like himself, the light back in his eyes, his smile a little less forced. He would clap me on the shoulder, a gesture of pure, uncomplicated male friendship, and say, "Thanks, man. I owe you 1 inch," and the dissonance between that casual, platonic gesture and the memory of his body curled against mine the night before was enough to give me vertigo. I was living a double life within a single relationship. By day, I was his steadfast, supportive friend. By night, I was something else, a guardian, a comfort, a silent keeper of his sleeping form. My photography began to change. I had always been drawn to lonely landscapes, to the stark geometry of empty city streets at dawn. But now my focus shifted inward. I found myself trying to capture the quality of light in my living room at 2 a.m., the way the blue glow from the television screen made the shadows deep and soft. I took pictures of the indentation his head left on the couch cushion, of the single coffee mug he used every morning, left to dry by the sink. I was documenting the evidence of his presence, creating a tangible record of this strange, liminal space we were inhabiting. It felt like I was trying to prove to myself that it was real, that I wasn't imagining the slow, careful erosion of the boundaries between us. The work was intimate, melancholic, and deeply personal. It was a visual diary of my yearning. There were moments of almost unbearable tenderness. One night, he stirred in his sleep, a low sound of distress in his throat. A nightmare. Without thinking, my hand went to his hair, my fingers threading through the soft, thick strands, stroking his head with a slow, soothing rhythm. "It's okay," I whispered, the words barely audible. "You're okay." "I'm here," he settled almost immediately, his breathing evening out, and he leaned into my touch, a soft sigh escaping his lips. My hand froze. I had crossed a line, initiated a touch that couldn't be explained away by accident or gravity. But he didn't pull away. In his sleep, he accepted it. That moment became a secret I held close, a tiny, glowing ember of hope in the vast darkness of my uncertainty. He was letting me in, even if only his subconscious was aware of it. The anxiety, however, was a constant companion. I would lie awake, his arm draped over me, and my mind would spin. What did this mean? Was I taking advantage of his vulnerability? Was I a terrible friend for wanting this to be more than it was? I was terrified of the morning, of the moment when the lights would come on, and we would have to return to our designated roles. I feared he would wake up one day and truly see the situation for what it was, not just two friends helping each other out, but a fragile, lopsided dynamic built on his need and my secret love. I imagined the dawning horror in his eyes, the embarrassed apology, the hasty retreat. The thought was a physical pain, a cold dread that would grip me in the middle of the night. This ritual we had built was a sanctuary, but it was also a prison. It kept him close, but it also kept me silent, trapped by the fear that a single honest word would bring the whole beautiful, precarious structure crashing down around us. And then came the night of the rain, the night that changed the very nature of the silence between us. It had been a particularly bad week for him. A project at work had gone sideways, and the stress was radiating from him in palpable waves. He arrived at my apartment looking utterly defeated, his shoulders slumped, the skin under his eyes dark and bruised looking. He didn't even suggest a movie. He just collapsed onto the couch, pulled a throw blanket over himself, and curled into a tight ball, facing the back cushions. It was the most closed off I had ever seen him, a clear signal that he needed space. I respected it. I made myself dinner, tidied up the kitchen, and settled into the armchair across the room with a book. I could feel his misery from across the room. It was a dense, heavy presence. The rain started around 10, a soft patter at first, then a steady, percussive drumming against the window pane. After an hour of silence, punctuated only by the rain and the turning of my pages, he spoke, his voice muffled by the cushions. "Sam." "Yeah," I answered, my heart giving a little jump. "Can you? Will you just sit here?" On the couch. He didn't turn to look at me. The request was aimed at the back of the sofa, a disembodied plea. I don't want to be alone." My book fell forgotten into my lap. I moved to the couch, sitting at the far end, leaving as much space as I could between us. He didn't move. We sat like that for a long time, him a silent, huddled shape under the blanket, and me a silent sentinel. The rain lashed against the glass, and the room was dark except for the faint orange glow of a street lamp outside. Eventually, his breathing deepened, and I thought he was asleep. I was about to risk moving, to try and get some sleep myself, when he shifted. He uncurled himself slowly, deliberately, and turned over to face me. His eyes were open, glistening in the dim light. He looked at me with an expression I had never seen before, a raw, unguarded vulnerability that went beyond sadness. It was a look of profound, aching loneliness. And that was when he reached out. That was when his fingers found mine, and his thumb began to trace those slow, deliberate circles over my knuckles. It wasn't the touch of a sleeping man. It was conscious. It was intentional. The air crackled. The sound of the rain faded to a distant hum. My entire universe shrank to the point of contact between our hands. This was it. The moment the photograph finally resolved, when the image became terrifyingly, breathtakingly clear. He was awake. He knew what he was doing. And he wasn't stopping. He held my gaze, his eyes searching mine, asking a question that had no words. And as I met his gaze, my fear was finally, blessedly, eclipsed by a wave of pure, unadulterated hope. I tightened my grip on his hand, a silent answer to his silent question. Yes. The silence that followed the linking of our hands was different from all the silences that had come before. It was not a silence of comfort, or grief, or exhaustion. It was electric, charged with unspoken confessions and years of pent-up longing. My mind, usually a chaotic storm of analysis and self-doubt, went perfectly, terrifyingly still. There was only the feeling of his skin against mine, the weight of his gaze, the sound of the rain, and the frantic, hopeful beat of my own heart. I felt as if I were standing on the edge of a cliff I had only ever viewed from a safe distance. For years, I had been content to study the geology of it, to photograph the way the light hit the rocks, but I had never dared to get this close to the edge. He was the one who finally broke the stillness. He squeezed my hand once, a small, reassuring pressure, and then he began to move. He moved with an agonizing slowness, as if testing the air for resistance, giving me every possible opportunity to pull away, to stop him, to retreat to the safety of our established friendship. He pushed himself up onto one elbow, his eyes never leaving mine. The blanket pulled around his waist, and the dim, ambient light from the street lamp outside carved his face into a landscape of shadow and light. I could see the pulse beating in the hollow of his throat. He was just as nervous as I was. That realization, more than anything, gave me courage. This wasn't one-sided. This wasn't me projecting my feelings onto a grieving friend. This was happening. This was real. He leaned in closer, and the space between us shrank until I could feel the warmth of his breath on my cheek. Still, he hesitated. He was inches away, poised on the brink, and his eyes were filled with a question that was so vulnerable it almost broke my heart. "Sam," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion I couldn't name. It was the first time he had spoken, and the sound of my name on his lips in that moment felt like a physical touch. Is this okay?" The question hung in the air between us, a fragile, beautiful thing. He was giving me an out. He was handing me back the key to the sealed door, allowing me to lock it for good if I wanted to. In that moment, I saw the two paths laid out before me with absolute clarity. I could say no, or laugh it off, or pretend I didn't understand. I could preserve the friendship, the safe, stable structure we had built, or I could step off the cliff. I could choose the terrifying, uncertain, beautiful freefall. I thought of all the nights I had sat here, aching with a love I thought was unrequited. I thought of the secret collection of moments I had stored in my heart, and I knew there was only one possible answer. I didn't speak. I simply raised my free hand, the one he wasn't holding, and cupped the side of his face. His skin was warm, a faint stubble scratching against my palm. He closed his eyes at my touch, a soft, shuddering breath escaping his lips, and leaned into my hand. That was my answer. That was my yes. And then he closed the remaining distance between us and kissed me. It was not a kiss of passion or demand. It was a kiss of discovery, of reverence. It was tentative, soft, a gentle pressure of his lips against mine. It was a question, an apology, and a confession all at once. It tasted of rain and salt and a quiet desperation that mirrored my own. I responded in kind, a mirror of his own gentleness, a silent communication that this was not only okay, but that it was something I had been waiting for, hoping for years. The kiss lasted for only a moment, but it contained entire lifetimes of unspoken words. When he pulled back, he didn't go far. He rested his forehead against mine, our noses brushing, his hand still holding mine tightly, my other hand still cradling his face. We stayed like that, breathing the same air, our eyes closed, letting the reality of what had just happened settle over us. Leo, I breathed out, the name a prayer. I'm sorry, he whispered, his voice trembling slightly. I don't know what I'm doing, don't be sorry. I managed to say, my own voice unsteady. Just, don't be sorry for this. He kissed me again, and this time it was deeper, more certain. There was a sense of relief in it, of a dam finally breaking. It was a kiss that acknowledged the shift, the crossing of a line from which there was no return. And as I kissed him back, a profound sense of peace washed over me, quieting the storm that had been raging inside me for so long. The photograph had finally developed. The image was clear, and it was more beautiful than I ever could have imagined. The aftermath was not the explosion of clarity I had hoped for, but a slow, confusing fog. The morning after the kiss was a masterpiece of awkwardness. We woke up tangled together on the couch, the gray morning light filtering through the window, exposing the intimacy of our position. For a moment, it felt right, natural. Then Leo's eyes fluttered open, and a wave of something, panic? Regret, washed over his face. He untangled himself from me with a speed that felt like a rejection, sitting up and running a hand through his already messy hair. He wouldn't meet my eyes. I should go, he stammered, his voice rough with sleep. I have that early meeting. He didn't have an early meeting. It was Saturday, but I didn't call him on it. I just nodded, my chest feeling tight and hollow. The beautiful, fragile connection of the night before seemed to be evaporating in the harsh light of day. He gathered his things, a stray sock, his phone, the keys he now kept on my counter, with a frantic, clumsy energy. He was a startled animal desperate to escape a trap. At the door, he paused, his hand on the knob, his back still to me. Sam, he said, his voice quiet. Last night, he trailed off, unable to finish. It's okay, Leo, I said, my own voice betraying none of the turmoil I felt. I was reverting to my default setting, the calm, accommodating friend, the observer. He finally turned to look at me, and his eyes were a chaotic mix of confusion and apology. I'm really messed up right now, he said, the words a shield. I'm sorry if I gave you the wrong impression. The words landed like stones in my stomach. After everything, the months of seeking comfort, the shared silence, the conscious, deliberate way he had held my hand and asked if it was okay, he was reducing it to a mistake, a symptom of his grief. A flare of anger, hot and sharp, cut through my confusion. But I swallowed it down. I just gave him a tight, forced smile. He gave me one last, tortured look, and then he was gone, the click of the door latch echoing in the sudden, deafening silence of my apartment. The days that followed were a special kind of hell. The ritual was broken. There were no more late-night texts, no more movie nights. My couch felt unnaturally large and empty. The silence in my apartment, once a source of peace, now felt oppressive, mocking. Leo's texts became sparse and functional. Hey, hope you're having a good week. Sorry, swamped with work. They were the kind of messages you send to an acquaintance, not the person who held you while you slept for 3 months. He was building a wall, brick by painful brick, and I was watching him do it, powerless to stop it. My mind became a courtroom where I was both prosecutor and defendant. I replayed the kiss, the entire night, over and over, dissecting every moment. Had I misread everything? Had I been so lost in my own longing that I had projected intent onto his actions? The phrase, the wrong impression, became my tormentor. It suggested that I was the one who was mistaken, that my interpretation was flawed. The vulnerability he had shown me, the question in his eyes. Had I imagined it all? My hope, which had soared so high, came crashing down, leaving me bruised and disoriented. I felt like a fool, a naive, hopeful fool who had mistaken a moment of desperate loneliness for a declaration of love. After a week of this agonizing silence, I couldn't take it anymore. The ambiguity was worse than an outright rejection. I was a person who dealt in clarity, in sharp focus. This blurry, undefined state was unbearable. I knew I had to do something, to force the issue, even if it meant hearing the words that would shatter my heart for good. I needed to break the stalemate. I needed to know the truth, whatever it was. It was time for the quiet observer to step out from behind the lens and into the frame. I sent him a simple text. We need to talk. My place. Tonight. There was no room for misinterpretation in those words. It was a demand, not a request. For hours, my phone remained silent. I paced my apartment, my stomach churning with anxiety. I cleaned things that were already clean, rearranged books, did anything to keep my hands and mind occupied. I was preparing for the worst, steeling myself for the final, clinical end of our friendship. Finally, just as I was starting to lose hope, my phone buzzed. A single-word response. Okay. When he knocked on my door that evening, it felt like a stranger was arriving. The easy, familiar comfort between us was gone, replaced by a tense, formal distance. He looked as exhausted and miserable as I felt. He walked into the living room, but didn't sit down. He stood in the middle of the floor, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, avoiding my gaze, his shoulders hunched as if expecting a blow. I took a deep breath, the air feeling thin and insufficient. Leo, I began, my voice steadier than I expected. What is going on? You kiss me, and then you vanish. You act like I don't exist. You owe me an explanation. He finally looked at me, and his eyes were filled with a misery so profound it momentarily silenced my anger. I know, he said, his voice barely a whisper. I know. I'm sorry, Sam. I'm so sorry. I've been a coward, a coward. I asked, the word hanging between us. What are you scared of? He let out a long, shaky breath, and finally, the carefully constructed walls began to crumble. Of this, he said, gesturing vaguely at the space between us. Of you. Of what that kiss meant. It wasn't a mistake. That's the problem. It felt more real than anything I've felt in years, and that terrifies me. He started pacing, a caged animal, the words tumbling out of him in a rush. My whole life, Sam, has been a series of straight lines. A path. You go to school, you play basketball, you get a good job, you have a girlfriend you're probably going to marry. It's all laid out. And I was walking it. And then Sarah left, and the path just disappeared. I was lost. And I came here, to you, because you're my best friend. You're the one person who feels solid. He stopped in front of me, his eyes pleading. And all those nights, sleeping on your couch, it started as just not wanting to be alone. But it turned into something else. I felt safe with you. Not just physically safe, but my soul felt safe. And I didn't want to examine it. I just wanted to feel it. And then that night, I kissed you. And it was like a light switched on in a room I didn't even know existed inside of me. And it scared the hell out of me. Because it meant the path I thought I was on, the person I thought I was, it was all wrong. He looked down at his hands, his voice dropping lower. So I ran. I thought if I could just put distance between us, I could turn that light back off. I could go back to pretending. But I can't. It's all I think about. I miss you. I miss being here. I miss you. I stood there, listening to his confession, and the anger and hurt inside me began to dissolve, replaced by a wave of overwhelming empathy. He wasn't rejecting me. He was terrified of himself, of what his feelings for me meant for his entire identity. He wasn't pushing me away. He was trying to outrun his own heart. The silence stretched between us, but this time it was different. It was a space for healing, for understanding. The confrontation I had dreaded had become a confession, and in his terrified, honest, beautiful words, I finally found the clarity I had been searching for. The air in the room after his confession was still and fragile, like the moment after a storm has passed. The destructive energy was gone, leaving behind a strange and quiet clarity. He stood before me, completely exposed, having laid bare all his fear and confusion. He had handed me the jagged, broken pieces of his heart and was waiting to see what I would do with them. My own hurt, my own anger, felt suddenly small and selfish in the face of his profound turmoil. He hadn't been cruel. He had been terrified. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that my next move would define everything that came after. I closed the distance between us, my steps feeling unnaturally loud in the quiet room. I stopped just in front of him, and, just as I had the night of the kiss, I raised my hand and cupped his cheek. He flinched slightly, as if expecting a blow, but then he relaxed into my touch, his eyes closing. A single tear escaped and traced a path down his face. I wiped it away with my thumb. "You don't have to have it all figured out, Leo," I said softly, my voice filled with a tenderness that surprised even me. "You don't have to know what this means for the rest of your life. You don't have to redefine your whole world tonight. All you have to do is stop running." He opened his eyes, and they were glistening with unshed tears. "I don't know how," he whispered. "I've been running my whole life. Towards the next game, the next goal. It's all I know." "Then just stand still," I said. "Stand still with me. Right here. Let's just start with that." A shudder went through his entire body, a release of tension so profound it was almost visible. He nodded, a small, jerky movement. And then he collapsed against me, his arms wrapping around my waist, his face burying into the crook of my neck. He held on to me like a man drowning, and I held him back just as tightly, my arms circling his broad shoulders, my hand stroking the back of his head. He was shaking, and I could feel the dampness of his tears soaking through my shirt, but I didn't care. There were no words, just the raw, honest language of two people holding on to each other in the wreckage. We stood like that for a long time, locked in an embrace that was both an apology and a promise. It was the end of the fear and the beginning of everything else. Eventually, his shaking subsided, and his breathing evened out. He pulled back just enough to look at me, his face flushed, his eyes red-rimmed, but clear. The fear was gone, replaced by a look of quiet, dawning resolution. "Okay," he said, his voice stronger. "Okay. No more running." That night, for the first time, he didn't sleep on the couch. I led him to my bedroom, and we lay down on my bed, facing each other. There was nothing sexual about it. It was an act of pure, profound intimacy. I watched him as he finally, truly, let himself relax. He reached out and tucked a stray piece of my hair behind my ear, his fingers lingering on my skin. "Your apartment really is quiet," he said, a small, tired smile playing on his lips. "I think I'm starting to understand why you like it. It's not so quiet anymore," I replied, and his smile widened. We fell asleep like that, facing each other, his hand resting on my hip, our legs tangled together. It was a sleep unlike any I had ever known. It was deep and dreamless and utterly peaceful. There was no anxiety, no overanalysis, no fear of the morning. There was only the solid, comforting presence of him beside me. The door was no longer ajar or sealed. It was simply gone. We had torn down the wall between the two rooms and created a single, shared space. The days that followed were a process of gentle discovery. We were learning a new language together, a syntax of quiet touches and shared glances. We didn't try to label what we were. We didn't have a grand conversation about our relationship status. We just were, together. The grand, terrifying questions about identity and the future were set aside, and we focused on the small, tangible moments of building something new. We learned that he was a terrible cook, but an enthusiastic dishwasher. I learned that he hummed, slightly off-key, when he was concentrating on his laptop. He learned that I needed at least an hour of quiet solitude in the morning with my coffee and my camera before I could face the world. The ritual of the couch was transformed. We still watched movies, but now there was no pretense. We would curl up together from the start, my head on his chest, his arms securely around me. The comfort was no longer a desperate, one-sided offering. It was a mutual exchange, a recharging of both our souls. His presence in my apartment became a permanence. His toothbrush appeared in my bathroom. A few of his shirts found their way into my closet. His ridiculously large basketball shoes became a permanent fixture by my front door. My quiet, solitary sanctuary slowly, beautifully, became our home. One Saturday morning, a few months later, I woke to the smell of coffee. I found Leo in my kitchen, wearing an old t-shirt of mine that was too tight on him, carefully pouring hot water over coffee grounds in my pour-over set, a technique he had watched me do 100 times. He was humming his little off-key tune. The morning light streamed through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air and catching the soft lines of his face. He looked peaceful. He looked happy. He looked like he belonged there. He saw me watching him, and his face broke into that familiar, brilliant smile, the one that had knocked the wind out of me on the basketball court all those years ago. But this time, it was different. It wasn't just for the world, it was for me. "Morning," he said, his voice warm and easy. "Morning," I replied, leaning against the doorframe, a feeling of pure, unadulterated contentment washing over me. I picked up my camera, which was sitting on the counter. Through the lens, I framed the shot. Leo in my kitchen, bathed in morning light, a coffee pot in his hand, a genuine smile on his face. It was a simple, domestic scene. It was a picture of a quiet Tuesday, a snapshot of a life being built. It was nothing like the dramatic, action-filled shots I used to take of him on the court. But as I pressed the shutter, I knew, with absolute certainty, that it was the most beautiful photograph I had ever taken. We had found our way out of the silence and the fear, not by shouting, but by learning to listen to the quiet. We began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together.